We are very fortunate this evening to have Jim Caldwell present to us once again. He's an arts and culture favorite and a great human being, great artist, great presenter. And this evening's subject is an artist very well known to many of us, Singer Sargent. It's going to be excellent presentation. And Sargent said that art is not what you see, art is what you make others see. And the great thing about having Jim present these different aspects of artists is that we not only see the work that they've done, but we understand what drives them, what is their passion, what techniques that they use. And that's all because the artist, Jim Caldwell, understands, and it helps us see what the artist sees. So I'd like to thank you again for coming this evening. And without further ado, Jim Caldwell. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks for giving me this opportunity to once again talk about my favorite artist, Singer Sargent. Most of the images in this presentation were in the wonderful show at the Legion of Honor called Sargent and Spain 2 years ago. I hope some of you had a chance to see that. In his early 20s, Sargent's fame and reputation had quickly grown with his exceptional skill as a portraitist, but we shall see that he was also supremely talented as a landscape painter, a watercolorist, a draftsman, and a muralist. In the next 40 minutes, I will give you a glimpse of the depth and breadth of his extraordinary virtuosity. In his prolific 50-year career, he produced more than 900 paintings, many of them very large, and over 2,000 watercolors. We will see that in addition to his genius as a painter, his career was driven by a remarkable intentionality or purpose. Here is Sargent painting in the courtyard of the Lions, which are holding up the fountain on his left. This is the Alhambra in Granada, Spain. First, I want to remind you of a little of Sargent's backstory. Sargent's father, Fitzwilliam, had been a successful eye surgeon in Philadelphia when his daughter died. His disconsolate wife, Mary, persuaded him to give up his practice and move to Florence to recover from this terrible tragedy. It was there that Singer Sargent was born in 1856. Singer was his mother's maiden name. We will talk about this watercolor later. To say that Sargent was precocious would be a significant understatement. He did this beautiful watercolor when he was only 14. Watercolor is a difficult medium, and he had already mastered it. I have not seen it documented, but I think Sargent had a photographic memory, which would help to explain his innate ability to record complicated visual information in his mind and put it to paper or canvas. His father wrote, "My boy John seems to have a strong desire to be an artist by profession. A painter, he shows so much evidence of talent in that direction, and he takes so much pleasure in cultivating it, that we have concluded to gratify him and to keep that plan in view in his studies." 4 years later, the Sargent family had moved to Paris, considered at that time to be the center of the world's best art education, and John was enrolled in the studio of Émile Auguste Drouin. This is Sargent's portrait of his teacher. Drouin was a leading portraitist whose radical teaching techniques allowed his students to paint immediately rather than the endless classical drawing studies of the École des Beaux-Arts. He encouraged his students to study the Spanish painter master Diego Velasquez, whose freshness and power had an obvious impact on the young Sargent, who became Drouin's protege. Early on, Sargent recognized the financial significance of portrait commissions, and he quickly developed the skills which would make him famous and successful at an early age. Sargent did this beautiful homage to his teacher when he was only 23. It was a critical and popular success at the 1879 Salon, that huge state-sponsored annual art show at the Palais des Champs-Élysées in Paris. This was already Sargent's third salon success. How unusual it must have been for the master to sit for his student. Clearly Durand recognized that Sargent had a very special gift. Look at the unusual off-balance pose, the exquisite hands in their unusual positions, the brilliant white cuffs, the intensity of the gaze, the little red accent of the Legion of Honor insignia on Durand's lapel, and the handkerchief peeking out of his vertical breast pocket. That same year, with Durand's encouragement, Sargent traveled to Madrid to study the paintings of Velasquez firsthand. He quickly fell in love with Spain, as I did the first time I went. Its architecture, its landscape, its people, its spirituality, and its many beautiful cathedrals. He returned 6 more times to drink its waters and become creatively refreshed from the taxing work of commissioned portraits. This map with Spain on the left and the Mediterranean on the right shows the 26 cities and towns which he visited, from Santiago de Compostela in the northwest to Ronda and Gibraltar in the south, to the island of Majorca in the east. The number of colored rings corresponds to the number of trips which included that city. He visited Barcelona 5 times, the capital Madrid in the center on 4 trips, and Granada in the south on 3 trips. Spain is a large country. The train system was primitive and travel by horse and carriage was arduous, but he was determined to see as much of this beautiful country as he could. This was his intentionality. He finished more than 250 paintings of Spain. It was common for museums, this one the Prado in Madrid, to allow artists to set up their easel in front of a gallery painting to copy it. On the right is Sargent's much smaller copy of Velasquez's famous, huge, and enigmatic Las Meninas, meaning ladies in waiting. He has simplified the interiors a bit, but he faithfully captures the figures in the foreground. This beautiful portrait of the famous Spanish baritone Manuel Garcia, commemorating his 100th birthday, was painted almost 25 years later, but it shows us that the influence of Velasquez's dark palette and earth tones had a lasting impact on Sargent's style. Look at the deftness with which Sargent painted Garcia's stiff collar, done with his biggest brush, and the gold pin below it, painted with his smallest one. And look at the simplicity with which he has captured this centenarian's warm hands and pant legs. From Madrid, Sargent traveled to Toledo and south to Andalusia, or southern Spain, which was ruled by the Moors from the 8th to the 15th centuries. This trip included Sevilla, Granada, and Ronda. He was captivated by the music and the movements of the gypsy, also known as Roma, flamenco dancers, and did many beautiful drawings to capture their movements. In drawing class, we call this a gesture drawing, with one's eyes focused on the moving subject, not looking down at the paper, restating the movements over and over again. There is such energy and expressiveness in his lines. Sargent did this charming small painting of a Roma dancer on that trip. He was already thinking about a large painting celebrating flamenco dancing, which he would do for the Salon when he got back to his studio in Paris. He loved this pose, with her right hand on her hip, elbow bent forward, the palm facing us, and the other reaching out with the fingers twisted expressively. She looks at us beguilingly with an accent of a sparkly earring. The complexity of the red fringed shawl contrasts with a simple white dress. When Sargent got back to Paris, he immediately started preparing for a large 8-foot by 11-foot painting to be called El Jaleo for the 1882 Salon. El Jaleo means chorus, and we can almost hear the musicians singing. This is music made visible. Sargent was a risk taker, and this is such a daring painting, with its large areas of black shadow and bold composition. At first, that black put me off. Notice the beautiful left hand of the flamenco dancer who looks like she might fall over backwards, the hands of the musicians on their guitars, the gorgeous folds of the dancer's white skirt, the splash of red on the far right, and the accent of orange on the one empty chair, the two shiny guitars hanging over that chair, and the shadows of the dancer and the musicians cast on the wall by the footlights. Let's look at some of the many drawings and paintings which he did in preparation for the final painting. Here are some of the sketches of the musicians and singers. Look at the number of times he drew the raised arm of the girl in red to get her snapping fingers just right. Look at how easily he has painted the red fringe on her dress and the red scarf on the woman next to her. This stunning little watercolor on the right is only 12 by 8 inches. It is getting closer to the final pose of the dancer. We can't see her features as she looks away from us. I love the deep, rich chocolate background and the dark blue of her bodice with its white embroidery. And finally is this beautiful full-size study on the right. I think that the dress and the hands and the shawl are more beautiful than they are in the final version. The model for the dancer was his niece, Renée Ormond, whom he painted when he got back to Paris. Before seeing these studies, it's easy to assume that El Jaleo sprang from thin air. This shows us that Sargent left nothing to chance or accident. He was very intentional. The final painting is much looser than the study because Sargent wanted it to look spontaneous and filled with energy, even though it was painted 2 years after he had seen the dancer. And he has made numerous changes. Note the beautiful high-heeled shoe of the dancer pointed to the right in El Jaleo, and the more casual shoe pointed at us in the study, and the more dramatic dress catching the light of the footlights. And of course, the lighting on the face and arms is very different. Predictably, this evocative painting was a huge hit at the 1882 Salon. Sargent's friend Isabel Stewart Gardner coveted El Jaleo the moment she saw it, and now it's in her Boston Museum. Art historian Nancy Heller says that El Jaleo is the best known and most powerful image of flamenco ever painted. It is unfortunate but not surprising that the Gardner Museum would not let this huge painting travel to the Legion of Honor. In 1875, the American expatriate painter James McNeill Whistler painted a very evocative and controversial piece he called Nocturne in Black and Gold, Falling Rocket, shown on the left. A beautiful summer night on the edge of a lake with a bonfire. The sky is filled with fireworks and stars. Sargent surely had seen this painting in London, and it appears to be the inspiration of his romantic and suggestive dance scene on the right. A moonless sky filled with stars. At first we only notice the 3 women, one on the left, 2 on the right, illuminated dimly by firelight. But then we can see in the darkness that each of them has a male dance partner, dressed in black behind her. The one closest to us is faced away from her, with his arms raised as well. It is such a joyous scene with her arms lifted up to the sky. The girl on the right dips down to the ground dramatically with her partner supporting her. There are at least 3 shiny guitars being played in the background. The richness of the deep reds and the neutrals in contrast to the bright white skirts is quite wonderful. When Sargent arrived in Granada, he was particularly inspired by the elaborate detailing and patterns of the Moorish architecture of Alhambra, as I was. The buildings are so exotic and so different than anything else in Europe. Let's look at 2 of the paintings he did there. The first is the Court of the Pool. Other contemporary artists, like the one on the left, felt compelled to painstakingly, not to say obsessively, depict the detailing of the carved stone screens and the tile patterns. Sargent's version on the right has left so much of the image to our imagination, drawing on our eye deep into the cool, dark chamber and through the opening in the back, offering just a hint at the elaborate Moorish details. There is so much to admire about this painting. Sargent only suggests the perforated stone screen on the right as he draws a flat brush of Naples yellow lightly over the dark background, picking up happy accidents. I use happy accidents to mean the uncontrolled way the paint is put on the canvas when the brush is heavy with pigment. not knowing exactly what will happen. In Italy, they call this sprezzatura, or studied carelessness. This contradiction of terms, studied carelessness, is such a good description of his painting style. Sargent is a master of knowing when to leave it alone. Sprezzatura is a wonderful addition to our vocabulary. I love the abstract triangle of cerulean blue sky in the upper left, and the sprezzatura in the reflections in the lower left, and the shadows of the horseshoe-shaped arches on the wall behind them, and the deftly rendered dome above the roof line and the hint of red to the left of it. Sargent has used his biggest brush on the wall and his smallest brush on some of the fine details. Finally, look at the shiny glazed tiles glittering in the sunshine reflected in the pool. Here's a fascinating surprise. Sargent painted this scene over a portrait of a woman whom you can make out in the dark band of the shadow underneath the roof. The red is a rose in her hair, and we can see her hairline. This is much easier to see when you look at the real painting. I think this quick plein air painting is a stunning achievement. The second one is the Court of the Lions, which we saw him painting in the title slide. He leads us into the Hall of the Kings with a narrow watercourse. On the right, we see another sunlit courtyard. Sargent only suggests the openings in the stone screens with a deft flick of the brush. As we see in the center, I have painted this scene from the inside looking out. A big part of the Alhambra is the Generalife Gardens, meaning Gardens of Paradise, which Sargent captures in this watercolor. The lack of landscaping in the palace courtyards is more than made up for in the rich greens of the gardens. Sargent loved the architecture, and in this scene he relates the gardens to a loggia and a beautiful ornate wood door. This exotic vase, which he saw in the Alhambra, is a watercolor tour de force. The piece reveals the technical and artistic mastery reached by the Madrid potters, an example and culmination of the long and complex evolution of the glazed pottery in the Andalus during the 14th century. Sargent has been able to capture this intricate Moorish patterns of the blue and brown glaze with such precision and yet looseness. That is what I love so much about Sargent. Precision yet looseness. I think the neck of the vase is particularly beautiful. It is called a vase, but I think it is more than likely a vessel for storing olive oil, seen here without its wrought iron stand. The Moorish or Muslim architectural influence in Spain was felt as far north as Toledo. I love this small painting of Santa Maria la Blanca with its horseshoe arches, octagonal columns, and round windows spreading a moody dim light in the cool interior. Notice how Sargent loosely depicts the elaborate tile patterns in the clay floor, quickly fading them to nothing, with just a hint of the wall tile in the lower left. This synagogue, constructed by Islamic architects for Jewish use, now owned and preserved by the Catholic Church, symbolizes the rich spiritual diversity of Spain, which so appealed to Sargent. Sargent discovered this Moorish wellhead in a Toledo museum and sat down to paint it. What a wonderful example of his virtuosity in watercolor and his draftsmanship. The teal band comprises braids, knots, leaves, and Kufic characters, an ancient Arabic script which repeat the phrase, "Happiness is for God," over and over. Sargent's ability to depict the three-dimensionality of the patterns is so convincing, and the precision with which he observed the patterns shows such patience. The rich layering of many warm tones is quite beautiful. In 1885, George Eastman introduced the Kodak camera. Photography had been invented in the middle of the 19th century, and the Alhambra had been extensively documented with very cumbersome and expensive large format cameras, as we can see on the left. This was the first time one could own a relatively small personal camera. It was quite expensive at first so presumably it was out of the reach for most artists. But Sargent bought one and was excited to take his own photographs, like the one on the right, just like any other modern tourist. The prints were small and black and white, but you could see that Sargent was eager to photograph this beautiful fountain, if just for the record, as we see on the right. He was fascinated by fountains, which he painted many times, and it is interesting that he painted this same one twice under different lighting conditions. The one on the left has a soft, shadowless light, which allows us to see the subtlety of the translucent marble. Notice the right knee of the center figure as it projects out towards us. Look at the way he has captured the water spewing from the upper bowl and the reflections in the water with quick, easy strokes of dark blue. The one on the right is much more dramatic, with its deep shadows. Notice the reflected sunlight flickering on the bottom of the bowl, and the white highlights of the water splashing from the upper bowl. He did this with scratches in the paper or a little bit of opaque white gouache. Finally, notice the dark doorway leading us away on the right. I mentioned that Sargent often traveled in Spain by horse-drawn carriage. My guess is that he painted this wonderful scene with the help of his new Kodak camera, as it would have been almost impossible to paint this scene quickly enough to capture the horses. He gives us such a great sense of perspective and motion. We are with him in the carriage, with a section of the carriage canopy on the left edge of the image. Look at the man holding the horse in the detail on the right. The Naples yellow of the road becomes the highlight of his arm. This grand view of the Sierra Nevada, meaning snow-capped mountains, is unusual for Sargent, who preferred more intimate scenes. These Sierra Nevada obviously predate the California Sierra Nevada, which were named by a Spanish padre in 1776. We can hear the goats bleating, and on the horizon we can see the curvature of the earth. The late afternoon sun has cast a cool shadow on the valley in the middle ground. Sargent was particularly touched by the common Spanish citizen, as well as the Roma, who were considered to be outcasts. He sought them out in many places. Here we see them waiting to be treated in a beautiful Renaissance loggia of a hospital in Granada. They are in all stages of wellness and despair. In the lower right is a man and his child who seem to be happy, but next to them is a woman in distress, and next to her is a very sick man on a stretcher. When we look at him closely, we can see how quickly Sargent painted him, with just a few bold strokes. This speed is important when painting people en plein air. Sargent also wanted to capture the intimate scenes of daily life of the Roma. Here we see a small, sun-dappled courtyard which is buzzing with activity, with 8 women representing 3 generations. The 2 young girls bend over a wash tub. The child to their left seems well occupied with her doll. It is not clear what the other women are doing, but the colorful richness of the multiple textures from the rough rocks which pave the courtyard to the deep purple grapes ready for the picking is quite wonderful. Again, it is evident that Sargent is painting this scene very quickly. Many of the Roma around Granada lived in caves or very primitive rock dwellings. Again, Sargent has painted a rich scene of multiple activities, from a man examining the mouth of his mule on the right, to a grandmother playing with her grandchild in the center, to a woman weaving a basket on the left. When we look closely at the basket being woven, we can appreciate the extraordinary skill and ease with which Sargent has captured the basket reeds with the quick slashes of a small brush loaded with paint. This is such a beautiful portrait of a Roma woman with her black braided hair forming a loop on the left side of her head. This is so different than his society portraits, and was clearly not commissioned. Her face is serene and melancholic, her eyes filling with tears, resigned to her fate as an outcast in the society of Granada. This portrait also stands in stark contrast to the images of the Roma flamenco dancer as a seductress. The bit of white blouse showing through the bright red robe and the dramatic squiggle on the left are classic Sargent sprezzatura. This unusual and intimate scene of a turkey in a small Moorish courtyard is particularly appealing to me. As with the Alhambra courtyard, he has left so much of the scene to be filled in by our imagination. Yet he gives us extraordinary detail in the head of the turkey and the decorative balcony. The richness of the colors, from the blue head and the red crop of the turkey to the burnt umber in the lower left, is very evocative. It is clear that he painted this with the simplest of strokes, big brush, little brush. Sargent also wanted to record the work animals of the Roma. Here is an intimate view of the interior of a crude stable with at least 6 pack animals, some saddled, some not, with the light streaming in through the thick masonry wall on the left to illuminate this dark interior. The floor is covered with straw, and there are 2 diagonal braces holding up the roughly structured ceiling in the back. This lovely watercolor sketch of a pack animal was a gift from Sargent to his friend, the Spanish portrait painter Joaquin Sorolla. Sorolla is considered by some to be Sargent's equal. Sargent wrote to Sorolla that he had so little time to paint for his own pleasure because he was so busy with his commissioned portraits. Sorolla, 2 years older than Sargent, was very sympathetic as he too was preoccupied with commissioned portraits. On the left is Sorolla's own beautiful version of the Court of the Pool. In 1907, when Sargent was 51, he was at the height of his fame as a society portrait painter. He had been averaging 17 monumental portraits a year, charging at least $130,000 in today's dollars for each one. He had been supporting his family, but by now he had accumulated plenty of money, and he had grown understandably impatient with the taxing work of commissioned portraiture. That year, he officially closed his portrait studio with the intent on focusing on his watercolors, painted for pure personal pleasure without any need to sell them. As we have seen, his skill as a watercolorist was unsurpassed. He would also concentrate on the Boston Public Library murals, which we will get to shortly. In this watercolor scene of the 2 musicians, we know that the mandolin player is blind without being told. Look at the contrast between the loose, uncontrolled wash of color in the lower left with the careful detail of the guitar strings. You can see that the hole in the guitar face, which he had penciled in to start the piece, got moved. I love this charming portrait of Sargent's sister Emily, also an artist, and their friend Eliza Wedgwood. They were his frequent travel companions. Here, Emily is hard at work on her own watercolor with a small brush held tightly in her mouth. Eliza, the contemplative one, looks away, lost in her own thoughts. Her face reveals that Sargent was not above using opaque gouache occasionally. When he was painting in oil, when he did not like his subject's face, he would scrape it to the bare canvas and start over. Of course, this was impossible in watercolor, so he redid her face with gouache. Look at the richness of the colors and the foliage behind them. This wonderful photo shows Sargent's remarkable commitment to painting en plein air. Here we have 2 shade umbrellas, a special easel, a collapsible chair, a side table, a box of tissues, and a water bowl, hiking boots, and a hat. The setup looks complicated, and he does not look comfortable, with his feet braced on some rocks, but he had learned to paint very rapidly. 2 of his last trips to Spain included the island of Mallorca, which is southeast of Barcelona. This beautiful watercolor looks down from high above the wild northern coast of that island. It is probably on the estate of the Austrian Archduke Ludwig Salvatore, who certainly knew the now famous Sargent. We can easily picture Sargent perched on a rock as he layered on the many beautiful browns and greens with bold strokes in the foreground. He carefully left slivers of white paper to depict a surf line against the cliffs far below. The watercolors of the ships in the harbor at Palma, Mallorca, are some of his best. This one has such a fresh and sunny palette. I like the blue shadows dashed across the white boat, the rusty stains from the anchor chain, and the flecks of sunlight reflected in the blue shadow. This one includes two bathers. His ability to quickly capture this complicated scene of ropes and sails and chains and rigging, as well as the reflections of the bright colors on the water and the shadows on the white ship's hull on this sunny afternoon, is quite remarkable. The busy port of Palma excited his lifelong interest in sailing. This stunning piece, which he painted in Mallorca, is one of my favorites. This tour de force in architectural detail shows off his draftsmanship. Sargent had an uncanny ability to combine loose, notice the area under the strong white horizontal band, with tight, notice the beautiful details in the shield in the center, with the two eagle heads and their wings spread over it. I also love the colors of the purple shadows and the ochre shade tones, and the drama of the very dark shadows on the left and right edges. The vegetation on Mallorca is particularly beautiful, and nothing of beauty escapes Sargent's eye and brush. The richness and intensity of the warm pomegranate colors with the deep red seeds against the blue-green of the leaves is wonderful. The roundness of the fruit is tangible. The composition of the orbs gives the image great depth. He was also fascinated by the patterns of the fig leaves on the right. The play of yellows and greens against the rich ochre earth is dramatic. Sargent never intended to exhibit or sell his watercolors in America, yet it was only after the continual prodding from a long-time American friend that he finally agreed to a show. It was understood that the watercolors would not be for sale. It was not that Sargent considered his watercolors to be inferior. He knew that they were good. It was just that the logistics and risks of shipment from London to the U.S. had seemed too much of a bother, and he certainly did not need the money. In 1909, 86 watercolors were displayed first in New York and then in Boston. The shows were a sensation, with critic comments like, "Only a man of genius could have done this work," and "they carry you off your feet," unquote. Sargent decided that he would consider selling the paintings as a group to a museum. And while the show was in New York, the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences, now the Brooklyn Museum, immediately made him an offer of $20,000, $500,000 in today's dollars, which he accepted. 8,000 people attended the 16-day run in Boston. The critic Evan Chartres put it nicely. Quote, "To live with Sargent's watercolors is to live with sunshine captured and held, with the luster of a bright and legible world." The Boston Museum, which was upset by being upstaged by the Brooklyn Museum, later negotiated to buy another set of Sargent's watercolors. We can't finish Sargent's story without touching on his murals, which are so different than anything else he painted. In 1888, after his first trip to Spain, Sargent was awarded the commission to paint the murals for the new Boston Public Library, which was under construction. In Spain, he had been touched by the intertwining of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism in Andalusia. In about 1500, when the Catholics had retaken Cordoba from the Muslims, the local bishop was instructed to build a Catholic cathedral. Instead of tearing down the vast mosque, he built a Gothic cathedral in the middle of the mosque. This extraordinary architectural juxtaposition is my favorite monument in all of Europe. We will see an image of it shortly. And we have already seen a synagogue which was built by the Muslims for the Jews of Toledo. Sargent decided the theme for this library murals would be the triumph of religion. He spent 29 years on this ambitious project. Painted in his studio in England and installed over 4 phases, the panels interpret moments in the history of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, as well as polytheism. Sargent was fascinated with religious iconography, and the murals are absolutely packed with symbols of all kinds. In this lunette, I particularly like the black and gold wings on the left and the many red feathers in the background. the Egyptian facing off with the Assyrian in the center, the lion and the black ravens in the lower right. Let's look at some of the many drawings and paintings he did to prepare for these murals. First, the drawings. Interiors are particularly challenging to render, and I find these two cathedrals in northern Spain particularly beautiful. The perspective and the spatial illusion are perfect. Then the watercolors. On the left, Sargent has convincingly rendered the 7 religious figures with the Gothic canopy above them in rich dark ochre tones. The scene on the right is in perfect perspective. He used a straight edge for the pencil lines of the columns, but a very steady hand when he was painting the flutes of these columns. On the left is a photo of the Immaculate Conception and the 7 Sorrows, represented by the 7 swords. It's a photo from the cathedral in Salamanca, northwest of Madrid. In the center is Sargent's watercolor sketch, and on the right is the final version for the mural. Note that in the final one, Mary now wears a crown as well as a huge halo. She is standing on a crescent moon, and she wears a stunning gold embroidered robe. She is holding all of the swords on her left side, an interesting refinement. The forest of 17 candles sets up a nice rhythm in the foreground. On the left is a poignant crucifix which he painted in Spain, and on the right, his version in the murals. Astarte was the Egyptian goddess of fertility, sexuality, and royal power. On the left is Sargent's first oil sketch. In the center, he painted her again, adding certain details. And on the right is the final version in the library. That he thought nothing of painting the same scene 3 times is his intentionality kicking in. The final version is so packed with figures and symbols, it is hard to take it all in. Finally, we have a lunette which Sargent called the Messianic era. The young Christ, with Mary and Joseph holding his hands, steps from the darkness into a fertile Eden, with a ribbon inscribed with Hebrew text wrapping around him, twisting into the sky. Pairs of nudes pry open the massive doors. On the panels we have seen, it is certainly the most easily understood. It's interesting that Sargent represents the fertility of Eden with the fruits and leaves he painted in Majorca, combining the pomegranate with the fig leaf. Sargent was disappointed with the critics' lukewarm reception of his murals when the library finally opened. The murals have recently been restored to their original splendor and are certainly worth a detour the next time you're in Boston. With your indulgence, I would like to show you a few of the paintings which I have done in Spain. I spent a month there almost 60 years ago, and I've been back since. Like Sargent, I immediately loved everything Spanish. On the left is a small abstract painting I did the year in 1964, looking down on the city of Granada from the Alhambra. And on the right is a large painting of the same view I painted about 30 years later, after my second trip. The streets are incredibly narrow. I was fascinated by the patterns of the tile roofs and the windows. I love this whitewashed barn set against the castle on the hilltop. Like Sargent, I try to use my biggest brushes as long as possible, and then my smallest for some detail. Plenty of sprezzatura in the foreground. This is Ronda before a storm. I love the many whitewashed walls in the sun set off against the dark sky. This is the entrance to the Alhambra with its tiny door and this massive tower. This is the Court of the Lions. Sargent painted it from the outside looking in. I love the reflections of the wet pavement. This courtyard is similar to the one Sargent and Sorolla painted. I love the reflections in the still reflecting pool and the glimpses of the city beyond. These are the wonderful gardens of the Generalife. I love the drama of the long reflecting pools and the fragile spray of water jets set off against the texture of the roses. Finally, this is the famous mosque at Cordoba. It is hard to capture this extraordinary space in a two-dimensional image. As I mentioned, it is my favorite architectural monument in all of Europe. Surprisingly, Sargent was drawn to depict the interior of not the mosque, but of the cathedral built in the center. Here, draped in red fabric, its high windows are bringing in light from above the roof of the mosque. It is a rich and wonderful little watercolor with lots of suggestive detail. I will finish with this gorgeous Sargent watercolor, which is perhaps my favorite of this show. Aranjuez is a city south of Madrid. It is titled Midday, but the long shadows indicate that it is already afternoon. The curved sweep of the stone bench and the back wall leads us to the dense, dark green foliage and a few diminutive figures. I love the negative space of the sky on the left and the long lavender shadows of the trees. Sargent finished the library murals in 1919. In 1925, after completing yet another mural, this one for the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, Sargent commented to a friend, "Now the American things are done, and so I suppose I may die when I like." 3 days before he was set to sail to Boston to oversee the final installation, he suffered a heart attack and died in his sleep. He was only 69. He is buried in a modest grave in Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey, England. After his death, he was given retrospective shows in Boston, New York, and London, but the art critics of the world had fallen in love with the Spaniard Pablo Picasso and the new wave of modern artists. It's hard to imagine, but at Sargent's death in 1925, he was dismissed by many critics as old-fashioned and stodgy, merely a skillful illustrator. He did not regain favor until 1950, when a huge retrospective was mounted in New York. I trust that this show of his Spanish paintings will help you to appreciate that Sargent's artistic genius went far beyond his beautiful society portraits. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming this evening. Remember, these First Fridays are sponsored by the Woodside Arts and Culture Committee, a group of like-minded volunteers who like to present interesting opportunities, like having fantastic artists like Jim come and present. And next month, it's going to be a little bit of craziness because we have the McNiven brothers coming. If you're familiar with Bucks and the eclectic nature of that atmosphere, you have to come and see the McNivens because they're going to be talking about how their entrepreneurship and the restaurateur aspect of their lives and what made them a very interesting group of people. So I hope you'll come back and join us for that. And I want to end tonight with a little bit of Sargent, who I think was a really cool cat because I've read a lot of his works. And when it comes to painting, one of my favorites is he said that every artist should have a man next to him with a club to remind him when the painting is done. Remember that, Jeff?
Yes, right. It's always a challenge. When is the painting done? And when you're painting plein air, it's done when it's done pretty quickly, so there's not as much of a question. But I'm sure it was the portraits that he did, that was always a question. When is it done?
So, thank you again for coming. Drive carefully and enjoy.